Good evening, everybody. This is the Book Club.
Okay.
And today we have a very interesting and intriguing novel called The Garden of Evening Mists. Now we have Sheena Shahani here to introduce the presenter. And let me just say a word or two about Sheena, therefore. So Sheena is today in Pune, but she's often in Dubai when she joins us. And she has had many years of a career in HR and journalism in Dubai. And she is a member of our book club, and she is going to introduce the presenter today. So over to you, Sheena.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I don't think Runa Mukherjee needs any introduction, but since this is a formality, I shall just do the needful. So today's presenter is one of my favorites. And I'm so excited that after I finish this introduction, I will sit back, relax, and let her words wash and soak all over me for the next 30 minutes or so. A former Indian Railways employee and currently a corporate executive, Runa Mukherjee has had a lifelong affair with literature, which she sees as a prism through which to explore and study people and society. Personally, she likes to read works that, quote, have a flavor of the times they are set in and enjoy the interpersonal dynamics and psychology of the characters, unquote. She loves classics, detective fiction, fantasy myths, and science fiction, and novels which have a sociological, environmental, and historical context, like today's book. The novel in discussion is set in pre- and post-independence Malaysia, after a career helping to prosecute Japanese World War II criminals. Teo Yun Ling, herself the scarred lone survivor of a brutal Japanese wartime camp, seeks solace among the hunger-fringed plantations of northern Malaya. This is around 1950 or 51. There she meets the enigmatic Aritomo, an exiled former gardener of the Emperor of Japan, who has created a garden called Yugiri, or Evening Mists. Despite her hatred of the Japanese, Teo Yun Ling ventures to ask Aritomo to create a Japanese garden in the memory of her sister who died in the slave camp. She wasn't so lucky. He declines but offers instead to accept her as his apprentice so that she can design the garden herself. And then Runa will tell us what happens next. The Garden of Evening Mists is Malaysian author Tan Twan Eng's second novel. One of Malaysia's leading English language novelists, all his three novels have made it to the Booker Prize long lists. Evening Mists even made it to the short list. His latest book, The Secret of Doors, is in this year's long list. Will he be third time lucky? Let's wait and watch for that one. And in the meantime, over to Runa.
Okay, good evening, everybody. I will share my screen because I have a presentation. And that presentation will take you back a little before whatever Sheena already told you about the story. Okay. Is a metaphor, a symbol of many things. It's a metaphor for a philosophy, a way of life, a way to express very complex emotions, and a way to convey a perspective on life. And it also brings peace and solace. Author Tan Twan Eng, he's a Malaysian who writes in English, a lot like us, because he studied in the English medium and so on. He studied law in England and also practiced in Kuala Lumpur before becoming a full-time writer. All his books show a fairly profound acquaintance with Japanese. He shows a very close acquaintance with Japanese culture, be it the art of martial warfare, which is Aikido, which appears in his first book, which is The Gift of Rain, or the art of Japanese gardens, archery, then the art of woodcut printing, and even tattooing, the Japanese tradition and the arts. And he shows a very intimate knowledge of all these things, as well as their literature and philosophy, the Shinto and Zen philosophies. And it's sort of woven into the fabric of his books, the first two books. The second book is the last book is a little different, but so he draws in the first two books. He draws upon the historical background of Malaysia in the first part of the 20th century, which means around the 1930s on up to, in this particular book, 1987, 1986. Background, because I myself like to sort of locate the story in its geographical and historical setting. So the locale is Malaysia, as you can see here, and you have Kuala Lumpur, which is the capital here, and the Cameron Highlands, which features so largely, is located somewhere here. And this is the island of Penang, which is where the heroine Yun Ling grew up. And this is a bigger map of the Cameron Highlands, which is very hilly, very mountainous, and full of tropical. It's covered with tropical jungle. And at some point, a person called Philip Cameron, I think, he surveyed the area, and that's why it's called the Cameron Highlands. And the British started having tea plantations there. Even to this day, there are a lot of tea plantations. This is the big golf club. It's known as the Tanah Rata Golf Club. And Tanah Rata is a town, it's a town which exists even today. It's still there. And this is Tanah Rata. And this also appears a lot in the book because, they live in one of these tea estates in and around here. These little circles are all mountain ranges. They're very big mountains out here. And they keep coming into Tanah Rata because that's their local town. And today it's a tourist spot because everybody goes around here. And so I'm mentioning these names, Tanah Rata, and I'm mentioning Majuba Estate, tea estate, because that also features very largely. And adjoining it is the property of Ugiri. So the characters I'll mention later. And of course, Penang and Kuala Lumpur appear peripherally. Now, the background is when the story is divided into basically, the narration is in a series of flashbacks. So it becomes a little confusing. Because
can I just ask one moment, where is this banging coming from?
The story is, so for clarity, it becomes a little confusing since it goes back and forth from present to past to middle. So I'm saying that the story is divided into basically three timelines. The first one is between 1936 to 1945, which you will all recall is just before the Second World War, which started in 1939 and carried on till 1945. And it's during this period that Yun Ling visits the gardens of Japan just before the war. And she sees all the gardens of Kyoto along with her sister Yun Hong, and they fall in love with the gardens. And between 1942 and 1945 is the Japanese occupation of Malaysia. And that is when they are interned in a slave camp. The second part is between 49 and 52. So what happens after the war when Yun Ling is freed and all that? She works, so Yun Ling is freed. She goes and studies law in England. She comes back and then works for 2 years as a public prosecutor before getting fed up with her job and comes to the Cameron Highlands. And the kernel of the story occurs during this period. The main events of the story occur during this period. And the third part is 1986, when Yun Ling retires prematurely. She is now a judge of the Supreme Court. She retires prematurely and returns to Ugiri after 34 years. And the background also, the historical background is a little important. So Malaysia was a set of states ruled by sultans. But after the 1824, there was a British Straits settlement by which the British, it was a colony, British colony, and they were a protectorate. So the sultans ruled below the British. The British controlled everything, except for certain settlements like Penang and Singapore, which originally had been controlled by the British East India Company and which Britain controlled outright. I mean, they were the sovereign in those two places. So this is the situation as it was till the Second World War. In 1942, the Japanese invaded all of Southeast Asia and they occupied Singapore, Philippines, and Burma. The British just retreated because they couldn't hold it. Post 1945, after the war, the British regained control of Malaya as a protectorate. There is a commissioner who is appointed to rule. However, the independence movement has already started. So there are a whole lot of people, the local populace composed of Malays, Chinese, and Indians. These are the major composition of the population. They enter into negotiations for independence. These are legitimate negotiations. However, there are also communist terrorists, and they are composed of a ragtag band of people who were earlier in the army, earlier in various, I mean, they're drawn from anywhere. So they are a guerrilla group, very widespread in all of Malaysia, and they have their affiliation with Communist China. And they conduct a very brutal guerrilla warfare. They loot villages, they burn them up, or they murder the British people, or anyone who stands in their way, really. Anyone they perceive as an enemy, they brutalize. And they ambush them and all that. It's guerrilla warfare. So as a result, the British declare a Malayan emergency. It's called the Malayan emergency, a state of emergency in which they deploy the army to root out these forces. And this emergency lasts, it was declared in 1948, but it goes on till 1960. In 1957, Malaysia is declared an independent member of the Commonwealth of Nations, but it gets independence only in 1963, by which time the communist menace has been rooted out. So this is in short. Now, the cast of characters, I will only mention these 5 because they are the main characters. There are many others, but not, I mean, it'd be too much to talk about them. So you have Teo Yun Ling, who is of Chinese extraction. She is the daughter of a very well-to-do businessman living in Penang, which, if you remember, was a British settlement. So she has a totally anglicized upbringing, and they consider themselves like, our brown sahibs. It's the same. So she has the elder sister with whom she's extremely close. They're more than with her mother or anybody else. And she loves her very much. Her name is Yun Hong. Now, at this stage in the story, we are not told anything about her war experiences or anything else. Just a little bit about her family background and her connections with these people. So when the story starts, she's a distinguished judge with a very, very distinguished career behind her. And for some reason which nobody knows, she has taken a retirement prematurely and she comes to Ugiri. Then we have Magnus Pretorius. Now, Magnus Pretorius was originally a business partner of her father's. But he then goes out on his own and becomes one of the pioneering tea estate owners in the Cameron Highlands. But he maintains a very close relationship with the family. He's a family friend. And Yun Ling always considers him as the uncle she never had. And he is the owner of the Majuba tea estate, doing very well, sending tea all over the world and so on and so forth. And he has always asked Yun Ling to come and visit him, and she never has, and so on. So he's important. I mean, he's an important character, especially in the main part of the book. Nakamura Aritomo. Now, Nakamura Aritomo is the exiled gardener of the Japanese emperor. He belongs to a family. His family lineage, all his family members have been royal gardeners. His grandfather, father, and the entire line before him. So it's not hereditary. It's a tradition which they maintain. And he was the current Emperor Hirohito's gardener when something happens. Nobody knows at this stage. But for clarification, he loses his wife and child in a domestic this thing, and he gets fed up, and for some reason he falls out with the emperor and he's exiled. So he comes and visits his friend Magnus, whom he has known for many years before that, because Magnus used to visit Japan. And he comes and visits his friend Magnus and actually buys the adjoining property of him, which he calls Yugiri. And he makes a Japanese garden here, totally free and untrammeled, with his own creative spirit and so on. And then, of course, it carries on from there. He's the hero, you can take. Yoshikawa Tatsuji is a Japanese historian and art expert. He believes that the war experiences of Japan, and Japanese domination, are something which should not be hidden under the carpet, but which everyone should know about, because you can learn lessons from that. And he writes history books, and he's also an art expert. The Japanese are very famous for their woodcut prints. So he knows all this, and he knows that Aritomo used to be a woodcut artist also. So he asks Teo Yunling to come and examine, because apparently she has a lot of his prints with her. He wants to come and examine and publish a few in his book. She refuses. It's only a year later, when she retires, she accepts his request and invites him to Yugiri. In fact, that is why she returns back to Yugiri, because all the woodcuts and all the prints are kept there. So then there is Frederick Pretorius, also an important character. He is Magnus's nephew, and he is the heir to the tea estate. And in 1986, when Yunlin returns, he's also an old man. He's a few years older than her. He's an old man. He owns the tea estate. He's been running it. He's been looking after her estate as well. And he's a character who has always been very attracted to Yunling. In fact, he cares for her very deeply, and is a well-wisher. So that's how he is. But he appears in the story, in the narration and the plot, only in the beginning and towards the end. Not too much, because he goes off and joins the British Army to fight the communists, otherwise known as CTs. Okay, now I thought I'll give a few pictures, because it's easy to visualize things. So this is what the Cameron Highlands looks like. A lot of tea gardens. This could well be a tea estate like Majuba. And then the corner, in the corner, you have this house, which is known as the Smokehouse Hotel, which was founded in 1937, still exists today. And it was built in the typical style, Tudor, pseudo-Tudor style, which all the British favored at that time in Malaysia. You find it mentioned in the book very often. It's in the typical Tudor style, and it looks so out of place in the tropical scenery and so on and so forth. So this is the Smokehouse Hotel. It's mentioned a few times in the book as well. And this is a very beautiful misty view. And it could well be Yugiri. So Aritomo's garden is called Yugiri, meaning evening mists, and it adjoins Majuba. Right. So the novel begins in 1986 with Yunling coming after 34 years, because she has called the connoisseur Yoshikawa Tatsuji to examine some woodcut drawings. We learn that Aritomo is missing, probably dead, and that he has left his entire estate, garden, and all his artifacts to her, absolutely. And of course, Ajuba Tea Estate is now owned by Frederick Pretorius, whom Yunling herself acknowledges as her only close friend. One should mention that Yunling is a very reserved person. She doesn't reveal anything easily. And even in the book, you find that, she talks about things, she lets loose little facts one by one. It's like peeling an onion, And she keeps a lot of facts back from friends and all that, and they only become revealed later. Okay. So Then we get to the reason. So we don't know right straight away, but we get to the reason why Yunling comes back. So she tells Frederick the first day she comes that she has been diagnosed with aphasia. It's a form of dementia, I suppose, the beginning, and is progressively losing her memory. And she's terrified at the prospect. And that's why she agrees at all to, to Tatsuji's request. Till now, she has not allowed any publication or any kind of publicity for anything. She's not allowed anyone to visit the gardens or anything. So that is why we realize that she calls Tatsuji, because she realizes she's going to forget everything. And then where will it all go? So she calls him to see whether, whether she can face the whole thing of making something public, which is very, very intimate to her. So on Frederick's suggestion, she starts recording her story. He says, why don't you start writing a sort of diary? And then, you can read it, and then things will come back to you. So she starts writing, and a lot of the story comes from these diaries, so-called. It's the narration is entirely in the first person. So we get to know that she's very close to her sister Yun Hong, and Yun Hong fell in love with Japanese gardens, and because she did, Yun Ling also took a big interest in it. And then just before the war, her father takes them on a business visit to Japan, where they visit all the Japanese gardens and so on and so forth. And then, of course, their war, and the two girls are imprisoned together. The father and mother are not. They are treated differently, which is not important at this stage. Acha. Then we get to know, why does Yunling spend time researching war crimes cases for the War Crimes Tribunal just after the war? The reason is she doesn't know where her camp was. She was the only survivor. And she wants to actually give her sister. Her sister died in the camp. And she wants to give her sister a proper burial. She really mourns for her sister. She suffers her loss and so on. And it's something which haunts her, also survivor guilt. It haunts her all her life. And she had promised her sister that she would make a garden and whatever. And the garden also comes out during the time in the slave camp. She and her sister would sort of imagine building their ideal Japanese garden. And it was this imaginary world which sort of kept them sane during the war. So the reason she researches the war crimes cases is also because she has to interview a lot of the criminals. And they were all Japanese soldiers, ex-soldiers who are prisoners now. And she thought by interrogating them, she would be maybe able to glean where her camp was. Right. Anyway, she fails. She doesn't get any hint of it anywhere at any time. Now we come to the real crux of the story, which is the second phase, about 1952, when she accepts Magnus's invitation to visit Majuba and meet Nakamura Aritomo, because Magnus knew that she wanted, she was mourning her sister, and she says, if you want to make a garden in her memory, then why don't you visit Aritomo, because he's the only Japanese gardener in the country, and maybe you can ask him to do it for you. So she accepts the invitation, even though she cannot stand the sight of Japanese. She's very, very angry about them and what they did to her. We also get to know that she lost two of her fingers in the camp. How, we don't know at this stage, but she did. And she wears a leather glove always on her hand. So we have this, and she comes to visit Majuba. And the background of the communist guerrilla warfare is there all the time. The emergency is on. They're, whenever they go by car, there's danger of ambush. They're held up by security checkposts, and they have to submit to indignity of searches and so many other things. The theme and legend of hidden gold is also introduced at this stage. Magnus, I believe, spends some time with some friends scouring the countryside looking for hidden gold. Hidden by some ex-colonial who is supposed to have rumored to have hidden his gold somewhere. So he goes around looking for that all over the place. It's just fun. Then Yunling goes to Aritomo. Aritomo refuses Yunling's proposal. He says, I will not take any orders. I'm not going to make any other garden. Besides, my own garden is not complete. I'm changing and remodeling it. So I can't take it. It's only after talking to her a bit that he sort of, you can see, he doesn't say much. He's a man of very few words. So he gives her an offer. He says, why don't you become my apprentice? There are two reasons. One is she understands Japanese. She, in fact, knows Japanese. How she learned it, we still don't know at this stage, but she knows Japanese, which is one reason why she used to be interviewing the war criminals as well. And she can interpret for him with the local laborers who are Indian. And Aritomo cannot communicate with them very well. And therefore, he keeps feeling frustrated as far as giving instructions is concerned for the garden. So he offers her an apprenticeship, and he says, "You learn, you work alongside, and you learn, and maybe at the end of it, you'll be able to make a garden yourself for your sister." So, so she accepts. She is a very independent person, so she refuses to stay at the Majoba homestay. Though Magnus tells her that it's very unsafe. Where will you stay, single woman? And she says, "No, you have a lot of bungalows on your estate. You give me one of those, I will stay there. And I will go to Yugiri every day, work, come back." So he does that, and he gives her an escort every morning and evening. And then what happens? Meanwhile, Frederick, he's there. He's with his uncle is training him to take over the estate eventually. And he's a very young, personable man, and he's very impressed with Yumi. He's very attracted to her. He takes her out and so on and so forth. And eventually, enough of a relationship develops so that Yunling accepts him as a lover. She also explains that I have taken lovers because she always felt that, she was never given much value as a woman. It was novel to her that there were people who were attracted. And therefore, she would indulge that. So they have a close relationship, at least at this stage. Frederick, of course, shortly thereafter goes off. He joins the British Army and he goes off to fight those CTs all over the place. So he's not there much. Now we come to the real meat of the whole story, which is the apprenticeship. Now, during this, Aritomo doesn't talk much, but he shows her things. And one of the things in a Japanese garden, they have they call it the art of laying stones, and it has its own philosophy and what you do. And it's very zen. It's very meditative. He says you have to feel with the stones. You have to see where they want to go, and when they go, they sort of place themselves in the right place, and then everything falls into place. Things like that. Then you have this concept of shakei, which is borrowed scenery. He creates his garden which moves and meanders around. The area is not that big, but it looks much bigger because he creates pathways. And for instance, there is a little basin, bamboo basin of water, and if you bend to drink, the branches of the trees just above it create enough of a gap to see a beautiful view, a perfect view of the mountains beyond. So this is what he calls the art of borrowed scenery. You use the surrounding scenery as part of your garden because you see it in the garden as part of the garden. You can't see it from anywhere else. So these are all the principles which are incorporated. And the garden, you realize, it becomes a metaphor of expression, a metaphor of managing appearances. He has, for instance, a portion of lawn in which he takes Yunling to a particular height and he says, "Look at the lawn." He takes her at the level and she says, "Okay, it's a lawn, it's a green lawn." He says, "Okay, now I'll take you up." So he takes her up to one place, and from that place, because of the play of light, she sees very clearly the yin yang symbol. The two fishes, head to tail. That symbol is very clearly seen in the way the grass is cut and the light it catches. It's very subtle. So things like that. And she says, "Oh, but that's a form of deception." He says, "What else is a garden? A garden is managing appearances. That's all you're doing." And so on. He's also an archer. He practices the discipline of kyudo, which is Japanese archery. And that's a whole different thing. I don't want to get in there. But eventually, Yunling forces him to teach her as well. And you find that they use a lot of Indian meditative principles, which you use in yoga. how you concentrate and you let the world fall away, and how you become part of the bow and the archer. You hear all of that in Arjun and Mahabharata and so on. So all of that is there. And so this goes on many years. She agrees to stay with him till the monsoons come next year. So that would be about 6 or 7 months. So by the end of that time, he's making a lake, he's making a big pond. The pond is completed. And the day it's completed, a heron comes and it sits in the pond. And you suddenly come to the present where, Yunling, when she returns after 34 years, she sees a heron and she wonders, is it the same heron? Cannot be. But there has always, Frederick tells her, there has always been a heron in that pond. It's never gone away. And this is a symbol which comes later. So, and very subtly, these two, Yunling and Aritomo, they become mentally attuned. And Yunling realizes he's also suffered for very many things. It's not always clear, but he enters into her feelings without saying anything. And that's why he doesn't probe, where it hurts. And as an example of how he admits her into shows a little intimacy, let's say, is by taking her on a visit to the very remote caves for bird nests. These caves are, the aborigines of the place, the local people. They don't go anywhere. They're like our tribals. They live there and they hunt for these bird nests, because we have all heard of Chinese bird's nest soup, right? Which is supposed to be very healthy. And Aritomo takes a lot of it. So he goes and gets the bird nests from there. And it's very remote, and he's not supposed to take anyone with him. So this one and only time he takes Yunling, and those people, those village people, those tribal people tell him, never bring her again. We're allowing you now, but it's not to be done. And so on. So, but it's a experience which he shares with her. This is a form of intimacy. Then the story sort of switches to the present, where this Yoshikawa Tatsuji, the historian, he's been studying the woodcuts, he's been seeing everything, and he talks with Yunling and tells her, do you know that I have a feeling Aritomo was working for the emperor when he came to Malaysia? That fight, so-called fight he had, or whatever disagreement he had, we don't know. And a lot of Japanese people who are very close to the imperial family were sent all over the world to scout out the land for hiding places, for God knows what, mystery. But he has this theory that Aritomo had come for that reason. And Yunling, when she thinks back, she says, I don't know. Question mark. Is that why Aritomo had come? Or is it because, is it really the avowed reason that he had fallen out of favor with the emperor, and that's why he had just gone away? But a bond develops between Aritomo and Yunling, and after the pond is completed and, it looks good and everything is fine and all that, there are incidents. There is a scene in which they both come close and they become lovers. They do. Without, almost wordlessly, their relationship is practically wordless. Okay, then big developments happen. Yunling, one late evening, she gets home and she's ambushed by a Siti party, and she's dreadfully, brutally beaten up just for revenge, because as a public prosecutor, she had sort of taken action against a lot of the Siti party people who had been caught. She's brutally assaulted, and she's knifed and left to bleed to death. It is only because Aritomo, in the morning, when she doesn't come to work, he goes, he checks out, sends her to hospital, and that's how her life is saved. Magnus creates a ruckus saying, you cannot live alone like this. You must come back to the homestead. What are you doing? Her father keeps calling her back to Kuala Lumpur and saying, what are you doing out there? I don't know what you're doing. And she doesn't agree. And then Aritomo very quietly says, why don't you stay at Yubiri? And Yunling agrees. And nobody likes it because, it's not done. But she doesn't care. She's a rebel anyway. So she continues to stay at Yunling, at Yugiri. Now, at Yugiri, around this time, now the monsoons is almost on them, and this is when Yunling was supposed to go away. But she's most reluctant to leave. Somehow, that period is very soothing to her. She feels peace, and the relationship presumably is completing a part of her. Now, around this time, there is a visit of a Japanese delegation. Ostensibly, this is a delegation which is going around the entire countryside looking for the bodies of dead Japanese soldiers. They want to carry mementos back and conduct, funeral rites over those mementos. It's a very thin story. Nobody really believes it, but why they're moving around, nobody knows. So they come and visit Aritomo, and they bring with them an invitation, a letter from the emperor's bureau saying that please come back and join up. Take up your old post again as the royal emperor, royal gardener. So Aritomo, you can't, I mean, amongst Japanese, you cannot say no outright. He says, I will consider. At the same time, the delegation mentioned that Tominaga Noboru has died. He has died by his own hand. He has committed seppuku. And this is a news which affects Aritomo enormously. Now, who is Tominaga Noboru? Yunling, when she hears this, because she was present throughout this meeting, she immediately, sort of gets very alert because she knows him. Very clearly, she knows him. We get to know about it a little later. Aritomo says, he was someone I knew very closely. And he sort of, he does a little tea ceremony bidding farewell to Tominaga Noboru. And after that, he tells Yunling, you are now almost recovered from your assault. I want to take you somewhere. And he takes her to a very remote Buddhist temple. They have to climb a lot of hills and mountains and so on. And he goes there. It's very quiet, very peaceful. And he says, this has always been, and whenever I'm troubled, I come here. This is what Aritomo tells her. And he takes her there. And then for the first time in her life, she tells him about her camp experience. And that's when we get to know exactly what had happened. And it was pretty bad. But she survives because she's smart. She says she realizes that I have to do something to survive. Her elder sister is very pretty. So she is amongst the group of girls who are taken away to sort of service the army men. So they are kept separately in a separate house where, they are used as the comfort women. And she inveigles her way into working in the kitchen because then she can steal some food, and she steals food and whenever she can, and she goes and talks to her sister through a window when everything is dark and nobody can see because all this is not allowed. And that's when they build their stories about the Japanese garden they're building and so on and so forth. And it's the only thing. I mean, her sister also doesn't like her fate, doesn't like anything. So they're in that kind of situation. And she's caught stealing food. And that's when the local captain chops her fingers off. So that was kind of, and she says, I mean, it was slightly lighter work and I was still beaten, but that's what. But as a result, she gets in touch with a guy, with a priest actually, who knows English and Japanese, and he teaches her Japanese. So she gets to learn Japanese. And when that man dies, he was an old man, he dies, they get a visit from a guy, from a person who is not of the army, but who everybody is very, very polite and very, very deferential to. And this person is Tominaga Noboru. He keeps coming periodically and he needs an interpreter. So Yungling is the only one who can interpret English, Japanese, and can talk with with the other prisoners or whatever it is. English. She has to translate some letters, papers, I don't know. So he uses her, and he also he's different. He's not like the typical army person. Very cultured, very obviously. And uh, he is the person at some point, when the war is ending, nobody knows, the prisoners don't know. What are they doing in the prison? They are actually building mines in the caves, the men and the women, everybody helping, digging deep into the caves and building mines. And at some point, a lot of sealed boxes come, and very heavy boxes, and they're all carried into the mine and they're sealed up and all that. And one fine day, Noburu takes Yunling in his jeep out into the jungle and says, run, because everything is going to be destroyed. We've lost the war. So she says, what about my sister? He says, I met your sister. And she says, go run, escape, because nobody else can escape. And that's how it is. And she tries to get back, and she sees the whole camp blown up, and she's injured. And it is finally the Aborigines who save her and bring her to a town, and then she's nursed back to health, and that's how she recovers. And she's the only escapee from that particular camp, but she doesn't know anything about it. I mean, where it was or anything. So this is the story she tells Aritomo, and Aritomo, they come back to Yugiri, and Aritomo suddenly takes a decision. He says, I have done small tattoos, but I've never ever wanted to do a proper tattoo on anybody before. And a full body tattoo is called a horimono, and only very expert people can do it. And he says, I want to do a horimono on you, but he has to get permission because unless she agrees. And she sort of says, okay, what will it be about? He says, it'll be all about what is important to you. You can decide what you want, and I will make the design. So that's how it starts. I want to now show you some examples. See, these are woodcuts. You might have seen this wave, which is a woodcut by Hokusai, very famous in the 17th century. So these are the kind of things which Aritomo also used to make. And normally people who could do woodcuts were also very good tattooists. And this is the example of a tattoo, a full body tattoo called a horimono. And these were and there's a whole history of tattooing, which is fascinating, but I won't go into it right now. So he does it, and it takes a long time, obviously, because it's a full body one, and then he has to color it and so on. So she continues staying. It's now the monsoon. There can be no work done on the garden, so the laborers have also gone. So day and night he does this tattoo, and they're close, and that's it. Then what happens? The final denouement happens. Suddenly, one fine day, some cities come into Yugiri, catch hold of Aritomo and Yunling, and take them to Majuba. And they find that Majuba is completely overrun by cities. Their guards have been killed and all that sort of a thing. And Emily is Magnus's wife, pretty close to him. They're all held there. Frederick is not there because he's with the army. So everybody is held there a prisoner, and they're all being interrogated. Where is the gold? Because we have found a person who was originally in the Japanese army, and he is talking of hidden gold. So Aritomo says this is a rumor. It is a rumor which is there with any army, that they hide gold somewhere. It was there with the Nazis, it's there with the Japanese, but it's only a rumor. Where can you hide gold out here? And Magnus also says the same. So they said, no, we know you've been looking for gold. So Yamashita was a general of the Japanese army, and he is supposed to have hidden gold. That's a real legend which is there in Philippines, but nobody has ever found anything. So the cities continue threatening them, and they catch hold of Emily to torture her. And Magnus then says, I will show you where it is. I know where it is. We found it long time ago, the entry to a cave. So I will show you where it is. So they take him. They take him away and leave these people. And everybody knows that this Magnus has just done to act as a decoy. And sure enough, meanwhile, Yunling calls for Frederick. Frederick takes leave and comes. And by the time he comes, they look all over the place for Magnus. About 4 or 5 days later, his body mangled, is found in a ditch. So Magnus dies. And it's a very tragic experience for everybody. Aritomo is very badly affected because he's a very close friend. Emily, his wife, was badly affected. Everybody was. So they all mourn him, and Aritomo overnight makes three woodcut prints and makes Chinese lanterns. You know those beautiful lanterns, which when a person dies, you sort of light a lantern and let it loose in the air, and it flies up and then flies down. It's like the soul going up and coming back. So they do that ceremony and so on and so forth. Meanwhile, the Horimono, that magnum opus, is complete. It's complete, and both he and Yunling are there, and Aritomo tells her one day that, that Japanese delegation which had come a year back, they have got in touch again. One of them has got in touch, and he's coming in a few days' time, and he's coming to see me. So she says, what are you going to tell him? Are you going to tell him that you will accept that offer? He says, I don't know yet. Let us see. Then the next day, he goes out. Evening, they always used to go for a walk together out into the hills. On this particular day, he tells her, I want to be alone. And he goes, and he never comes. And Yunling has a premonition. So that comes in the language, which I can't mention here. But so he has a premonition. Of course, a search party goes out. They never find him. They never find him. So she feels very betrayed. She feels also huge pain at the separation and everything. And therefore, she leaves Yugiri never to return. It is only her illness which motivates her to review her life and come back. And she invites Tatsuji for his research and all that. She develops a trust in him. He also has a separate backstory. He was also he's around the same age as Yunling, so he had also taken part in the war. He was one of those pilots, the kamikaze pilots who were destined for sure death. And there is a backstory to it, which is very fascinating, but I won't talk of it. But as a result, he knows of things, and he narrates the story of the Golden Lily. This is very important. It appears that the Golden Lily is a story which the Golden Lily is an operation which was a secret organization composed of the close relations and trusted members of the imperial family. The members identified in advance treasures, gold, valuables of whichever country they were going to conquer. And as soon as the army came in, they went in, took everything, and shipped it. A lot of it apparently was shipped to the Philippines, and they hid it. And they had made plans to hide this loot long before even the war, apparently. This is the story of the Golden Lily. They had an emblem of the Golden Lily, a gold coin with an embossment of the Golden Lily. And Tatsuji feels that Aritomo was part of this. Yunling wonders. She says, I can't believe it, because he had great sympathy for all the people in Malaya. He saved a lot of people. He saved Magnus and his tea estate from the Japanese occupation. They were not brutalized or made into slaves as much as others. There are incidents where he gets to free a lot of girls who were taken into brothels and so on and so forth. I mean, he feels for them. So she says, I can't imagine that he'd be party to this. Then she finally gives Tatsuji permission to publish all the woodcuts. She's even considering that, even considering to show him the tattoo. Her tattoo, she has not shown anybody in the last 34 years. So she is even thinking of showing it. And Tatsuji says, really, you have a full horimono, and all this while you've said, I don't know anything about it? She always feigned ignorance that Aritomo was a good tattooist and so on. So, but he says, if I have to see it, if it's on your back, I want to witness. So she calls Frederick. And they both see it, and that's a very beautiful description. And then what happens is Tatsuji, his mind is always working. He's walked around the garden a lot, and he makes a map. He says, I was wondering what would the garden look like if it was on a map, if it was like a woodcut. And he says all the landmarks of the garden, the lanterns and the pond and everything else, they correspond to very important landmarks which are on the text. So what does this mean? It's never clearly said. And Yunling keeps wondering, what does it mean? And it changes her entire view of how she should deal with the garden. Frederick says, this garden which was made, the pond, and there was a pavilion. The pavilion was called the Pavilion of Heaven, which is something which Yun Hong had said, I will have one. So he says, the garden in our honor has always existed. And this puts the idea in Yunling's head, okay, let me restore the garden and let this be a memorial to Yun Hong. Okay. And then this Tatsuji's discovery of the map of the garden and the correspondence with her tattoo comes in. And in the tattoo, there's all kinds of things. There's Majuba, there's Yugiri, there's the camp, there are the mountains, there are all kinds of issues there. So she wonders, and she says, okay, if Yugiri has to exist, the tattoo cannot. And then therefore she decides that, this Horonimo cannot survive. It must be destroyed. And she wonders who she will give that responsibility to. And she says, I can't give it to anyone. So that's another loose end, open end, which is left. So this is the end of the story, by the time she's old, and this is the resolution. And there are all these questions which you are left with. The mystery of what was Aritomo? Was he involved? Was he not involved? Was there gold? Is that what her camp really did? Was it hiding the loot? So on and so forth. But in between, what you really get is love, guilt, and a lot of suffering. Aritomo had also suffered. We know, he lost his wife and his child, his only child, in childbirth, actually. And then, the place where, her house and they also owned tea estates. They were all destroyed in the war and everything. So there is suffering. And that is Yunling's final resolution. She said, I still have some time. I will spend it in restoring everything, making this a museum. The woodcuts will be shown and displayed here. This will be a garden in name of Yun Hong. But the tattoo must be destroyed. And then she follows, she sort of starts adopting Aritomo's routine in the house. That is the understanding. And that's how it ends. And she says, Frederick is there, and we two will talk together and laugh together as only old friends can, that kind of a thing. And that's it. It ends like that. So recurrent themes, there is memory, the memory and how she says, memory defines who we are between the past and the present. And if you don't have memory, then who are you? Memory also transforms with time. It alters our perspectives. And sometimes she says, is this really what happened? Do I know exactly that this is when it happened? Or did it happen before and after? And, subsequent events defined it or redefined that memory, so on. There is also the themes of war, enmity, loyalty, and how these loyalties keep changing. I mean, there is Magnus, who fought in the Boer War. He lost an eye because of torture as a prisoner of war against the British. But he's living in a British territory. He's friends with them. He doesn't like it. He keeps maintaining his Boer experiences, the South African symbols of his identity, all of that. Then you have the CTs, many of them were Japanese soldiers who never returned back but stayed on. Many Chinese were Malays, but they didn't go with the independence movement. They went against the Malayans, and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of shifting and stressed loyalties. There are a lot of CTs who give themselves up and take the reward for giving information. Yunling herself is morally ambivalent. Aritomo guesses, that how did you survive? And she says, I used to inform against people who were trying to escape. So things like that. So there are all this, but there is also love, redemption, and a certain forgiveness. But, it's very complex and it's very indefinable. So it's up to the reader to assess what's happening. I mean, what to conclude. But it's a very beautiful book because the imagery, the imagery and the mountains and everything, they are the things which express the emotions, express the relationships. And unless you read it, you don't get it. Also, this is a book which actually is very, very rewarding when you read it a second time, because then, you can catch all the clues. which come in the beginning, which at a first reading you don't even give importance to it. It's written like that. So that's how it is. Thank you very much. I hope I haven't.
Thank you, Runa. Thank you.
One
Seems
hour.
like a very interesting book indeed. I couldn't finish it, I'm afraid. I absolutely planned to finish, but you know how life is. I got a little further than halfway. That's all. But you know the sense of mystery about the Far East and everything connected with the Far East comes through. It is beautiful, yes, but frankly, I found it a little irritating also at times. So everybody, please unmute yourselves now. You can come into the discussion. What did other people feel? Now, I know Sheena's read the novel.
Twice. And
yes, Sheena and Runa read it together.
Audiobook.
Can I just ask a couple of very ordinary questions?
Sure.
Go on.
What's this lovely scenery behind you? Where are you?
Oh, this is just outside. This is outside my balcony.
It's beautiful.
Last year.
Okay. Secondly, you haven't told us why Ling was interned. What was the reason for him?
Japanese occupation.
I know, but they couldn't have interned everybody. Why her?
They interned everybody.
It's frozen.
I can answer that.
Either they interned everybody or they made them work in the fields. Like in Majuba, they made all the workers work in the fields because they needed production, right? But otherwise, they interned everybody.
Every person in the
practically everybody.
Everyone in the population.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
I
in
can
cities
answer
and
that.
towns, I mean, they kept people there, you know, who were running essential services, but they were under their thumb. They were all tortured and beaten up. They were asked to.
I know of that. But I didn't realize that they had gotten hold of absolutely everybody in the country and interned everybody. That I didn't know. And the other one that I wanted to ask was that you said this Arimoto, he was exiled by the emperor. We assume that when a person is exiled, he comes without anything into another country. But he seems to have bought land.
Is the word self-exiled over a garden design. But, that historian says he and this Noburu, that Tominaga Noburu were childhood friends. And Tominaga Noburu was of the royal family. So he certainly must have been a member of the Golden Lily, that operation. But they were close friends. And Aritomo never says, he says, we fell out. I mean, I respect him and he was a close friend, but we fell out. We didn't see eye to eye over everything. And he says Noburu was a man of very rigid ideas and rigid loyalty. The hint is that maybe he didn't agree with him. And that's why he sort of said, I'm out, and came away. But it is clear he had money. He had his family money and all that, and he came with that. He wasn't exiled and stripped of everything or anything like that. No.
Last thing, before I give up, because you've spoken so much about the Japanese garden, and having seen many Japanese gardens, I believe that the designs, actually attain a certain kind of perfection. Absolutely perfect in the way they are made. Very carefully done, very aesthetic. Not quite the opposite of what you find in England, for instance, a wild garden that grows, as against a garden in Japan, which is. Then you start wondering whether behind this aesthetic is there not just a philosophy but something enigmatic, and does it in any way reflect the character of the people?
It probably does, but I must tell you another thing. They also feel that nothing should be too perfect. And in fact, there is a scene in which Aritomo, they've made the thing, the pond is there, the heron has come. Even the heron is part of it. And then, Yunling saying, now the garden is perfect. She's raked up all the leaves and it's clean and everything. And she says, now the garden is perfect. And he puts his hand in that bag of leaves and he scatters it across the lawn. He says, now it's perfect. There has to be some imperfection.
Really?
Yeah.
Maybe that's for the novel. I haven't seen anything like that, but maybe
no,
it's there.
Probably not. Probably not. But I'm sure it reflects a certain character. I don't know. The Japanese never been there, so I can't say.
And the novel doesn't go into that, right? I
Mm.
mean, there's a lot of discussion about how the garden should be,
Yes.
but really the philosophy behind the whole plan
Mm.
isn't spelled out.
It's implied.
So what was it? What was the philosophy behind the plan?
Then you'll have to talk of Zen philosophy. It's a
I
whole.
think it's left to the reader.
And
It's
it's up
left
to
to
the
the reader
reader.
to
Yeah.
yeah, it's up to the reader to infer and take away what whatever interpretation.
Yeah.
Lyrical,
Mention
beautifully
anything about the
written.
language
It's
at all.
beautifully,
It's
and
lovely.
everything is implied, not
Yeah.
stated
Lyrical
directly.
is
And so, yes, and so
It's like the
it's not one
characters.
of those.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think you miss a lot if you are into quick reading. It's
Mm.
it's a book that has to be read in bits and pondered over. It's not one of those things that you can. Yes, I guess you can read it at one sitting, but then one needs to go back to it, like
One
Runa
needs
said.
to go back.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it
Can I just
conveys a
say-
mood. There is no doubt that it conveys a mood.
Yeah.
And yeah, it conveys a mood which grips you. And it's just like the characters. I was thinking on second reading that actually all this obliqueness, nothing is stated overtly. All this obliqueness is very typical of the two characters, both Haritomo and Yunling. They're both people who don't talk too much. They don't explain things, but they feel them. They feel them. They
What I
experience
found
them.
in the book is,
And very
when we read it, is that you go back to the bibliography and there are a lot of themes which are introduced. And you go back to the bibliography and you look up the themes, like the art of placing stones and
Yes.
the whole concept of the Japanese garden, if you were to sit and read it. And it introduces you to this world that these people are inhabiting, So, what is perfection in the Japanese sense, and what is not, and things like that.
No,
And
also the discipline, because those dry gardens which they call the Kore Sensui garden, made only of pebbles and all that. Those dry gardens have to be raked every day. That is discipline, and it's hard work. It's not very easy work. So that is the character that they will do something repetitive to maintain and create beauty. It's like a meditation, and as you do it, you get into it, and it's part of you. Even this whole art of that Horimono, when he's tattooing, he says, there is a connection between the artist and the person on whom it's done. He says, it draws out, while I'm inking, it draws out the very thoughts and feeling of the person on whom it's done. And that's when he asks her, what did you do to survive in the camp? And she says, I was an informer.
I just want to
I betrayed my
answer.
people.
I just want to answer Latika's question. Why was Yunling and her sister captured?
Yeah.
So, I think her father was a timber merchant, and there was something about the Japanese thought that he was hiding some communist terrorist informers, and he wasn't giving out the information. So there was something like that. There was something he was hiding, or they felt that he was hiding, and they said, "Okay, we're going to take your daughters."
Money, probably.
Something.
He was a very rich. He was a rubber plantation owner.
Yeah, timber
He
plantation.
had money, and he had taken refuge with an old neighbor of his somewhere else. And they rounded up everybody. They bet up the men and the young girls. Young girls and boys they took away.
And they beat up the mother as well.
Then they beat up the mother, and the mother saw father being beaten up, and she lost her mind in the process.
To go, Mohini, out. So can I take a leave? Thank you, Runa. It was wonderful. I love buddy reading it with you, and I enjoy reading it again. It's a beautiful book. And I recommend that, Mohini, you finish it, because
she got irritated with the mystery. But I think the mystery is the whole part of it. And I was wondering whether I should reveal and whether it would be a spoiler. And then I realized you can't talk about the book unless you do reveal,
And now reading it again, I feel that maybe Aritomo went back to Japan. Maybe he took the
See,
emperor.
that's a question mark. That is certainly a
A
question mark.
huge question mark, isn't it?
Huge question mark. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Good night, guys.
Okay, bye, Sheena. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Wispy, I think you had put up your hand.
No, I'm sorry, I haven't read the book. And so I found this very intriguing. I think Runa did a super job, I think that we tend to consider the Japanese enigmatic on the whole, don't we?
Yes.
It's a
Because we
stereotype.
don't know anything about them.
Yeah, I think it could be a stereotype, but and of course the brutalities of war.
Oh, well,
It's terrible.
And it's not
Wherever-
just the Japanese, because Magnus talks of his experiences in the Boer War. When he was in South Africa, he was a young man in the army and they fought the British, the last Boer War. He was taken prisoner of war to Ceylon. And he says, Yunling, when she meets him, she says, they did this to me, and shows her missing fingers. And he says, and he has an eye patch. He has one eye. He says, do you think this fell out by itself? So the thing is, got over it. And he says, I realized, in fact, he says somewhere, he said, I realized totally destroyed. They were all killed. I got over the fact that my country was taken over by the British. I got over all of this. I got over my, but it will ruin my life, and my anger. And this is the advice he gives at that stage, because she has a lot of anger in her.
yes.
In the beginning.
Well, all I'd like to say is, if I have a chance,
Yes.
that I have not really read Japanese literature much, maybe one novel, but that's it. But I've seen many films, and some of the major filmmakers of Japan, the early filmmakers who are now regarded as masters, Kurosawa and Ozu, and to some extent Mizoguchi, all three of them, they're all the classic filmmakers and masters of Japanese cinema. Very different one from the other. However, when you see their films, even when Kurosawa is showing violence, there's something that is being restrained, something that is being withheld. Not everything is said or suggested. And to recognize what that something could be. Maybe it's a little bit same with the Japanese characters.
Yes, like the interpretation left you. Maybe it's a Southeastern thing. Who knows? I mean, I have never read any other Malaysian author. So maybe it's a way of looking at life. Nothing is overtly stated.
Nothing is overtly stated.
Have you seen the film? By the way, I closed with a clip from the film, which is not legally available in India, in the sense it's on HBO Max. So if any of you have a VPN, can see it. I believe the film was very well done.
Mm-hmm.
It came out in 2019. Shanti can see it.
Yeah, I can. And I will. I didn't know it was available on HBO Max.
It's available,
but,
yeah.
I'm thinking about it. I find that even in our...
Usha Pasi is a newcomer there. So is Gurinder and Beena Balkrishnan.
Okay, she said, I hand over my paycheck every month to my husband and he controls all the money. And then later she told me, she said, I support my mother financially. And I said, what does your husband say to that? She said, why would I ask him? I don't ask him. It's not his business. And I said, where do you get the money? And then she looked at me very surprised and she said, I don't give him everything.
Exactly.
And I said, but you told me that you handed your paycheck. And she looked at me like I was from, don't you understand what I'm saying? So there's one statement made for public consumption, but there's something else that goes on behind the scenes.
Yeah.
And it took me a while not to butt in. She was one of the first women I interviewed, not to butt in with these questions. Like I met women who were living with men that they were not married to.
Yeah.
And so with my, understanding of relationships, both as, having grown up in the North, having lived in the West. I just assumed these people were married, and they were not. But they never said they were. They never said they were married, and they never said they were not married. So a lot of it is unstated, even in our culture. Even in family dynamics, when you don't say something, once something is articulated and it's out in the open, there's no going back. So you don't state it. But everyone knows about it, but no one talks about it,
Yes, but I don't know. I feel, Shanti, I hear you. And this must be the case in any society, that something's not stated up front, as it were, but exists and people know, but it's not talked about. But with this Far Eastern picture, it's something else.
In the Japanese context, there's a lot of formality in everything, which you don't always have in India. And that formality defines your behavior and your relationship with people. At least the kind of what I'm drawing from films. I can't say I've read literature.
A lot of things are
and
done.
I think to say Far East is a generalization. It's the
No, I'm talking Japan.
Japanese.
Yeah, I'm talking Japan.
I don't know if the Vietnamese and the Cambodians, are, or the Thai are like.
Not necessarily.
But
Here we're dealing with Malayans.
No, I don't think so. I don't think so.
With Malayans, Chinese, Japanese.
Japanese are changing.
I think Japanese themselves are a different people.
One sec. Satish is saying
No,
something.
I just said the Japanese are changing. That what we are talking about, that the way they work, etc., has changed considerably over the last 10, 15 years. You remember 30 years back, the gentleman who's come, he will be completely different.
Lost your voice.
Okay.
Lost your
there are a few people like Usha Pasi, Gurinder and Beena who have not come here before. So Usha, we would like to hear from you.
Would you like to pipe in?
Sure. I have to admit, I joined at the invitation of Shanti, who's a dear friend. I've not I'm reading the book now, and I'm very interested to hear Runa's synopsis and summary. I live in Boston, outside Boston, in the United States. So I went to Japan a few years ago. I spent a week there. And I was struck. It was like the United States in the 1950s. It seemed some things were so, the taxi cab drivers, how people interacted and everything. But it was clear that much was kept beneath the surface and had to decode, right? Societies like that, they're formal, and they're things they don't talk about. And society's very structured really differently. I don't think it's just philosophy; it's culture and history. But I'm honored to be here, and I will certainly read the book with a careful eye. I have heard a lot about Tan Twan Eng, and it's interesting that he's from, his culture and his familiarity with Japanese culture, his birth, where he was born. He lives in Kuala Lumpur in Africa,
And he has his first book. My brother told me, because my brother is also Aikido, and it's all about Aikido, and again, the Aikido or anything else. And it's also a metaphor. In the book, it's used as a metaphor for people who are suffering or who have gone through adventures or whatever it is, which have done something to them, and then this art is what gives them sort of resolution and release. So he's written a lot about it about Aikido and the samurai code. That is what the Gift of Rain is about. Though it's set in Malaya, but that's what it's about. And the House of Rose I've recently read. Why? Because it features as a character one of my favorite authors, Somerset.
Is it out in the market?
Market.
Not in the US yet.
It's out in the market. So I liked it very much. And this actually is set long before, obviously. It's in the early part of the 19th century, 1920s and so on. And a lot of it is about China and Sun Yat-sen. The political background is that. So this guy obviously has done a lot of research into all these things. Yeah.
Okay.
I have a question for you, Runa. there's a lot, I'm very involved with some book organizations in this country, but in Boston actually. But one of the things that comes up here a lot are the notions of identity. And do you think the book presents, I mean, it's historical fiction, but does it also present any perspectives on feminism? Do you think he cares about that as an author? Or is he more interested in the questions of art and beauty and gardens and this historical fiction question rather than the questions of identity? I'm just curious.
So I think if you really read any of his books, he doesn't have any kind of message to put forth, but he does depict women. I mean, Yunling is a very independent woman, and from when? From Second World War onwards. The
Right.
people she knew, then Magnus's wife, Emily, they're not stereotypical feminine women, they're people in their own right, own minds and independence. And in the House of Doors, which is even earlier, there he does bring out these concepts of feminism. And I think he's a feminist, because the heroine, she behaves as she's expected to behave. And she's a British woman, but there are certain roles which are expected of her as the wife of a barrister, and in her society, and how she lives, how she behaves, how she talks, what she wears, what she does. And in her mind, when she looks at other things, she thinks differently. And it's made out very clearly that she thinks differently from the other women of her society. And then she herself questions, just because I'm a woman, why do I have to do that? And why can't I? And she steps out. She breaks certain codes and does it. And it's a good thing her husband allows it as well. So if you look at it from that perspective, the House of Doors, which is also evocative, I must tell you that.
Gurinder, can you hear me?
You on the mailing list, so that you know what the calendar
That will be
is.
wonderful.
I must mention that Gurinder and Beena were part of Pakis and my book club.
Okay.
My book club.
Yes, I can hear everybody.
Gurinder, why don't you put on your video? Let us see you.
Hey,
Hi,
I
Kavit.
don't know how I missed tuning in to today's session. Somehow I got very preoccupied with various other things I'm doing. And then I said better late than never, because Runa is always so thorough, as most of the other presenters that you all have. And I was so interested in learning something about this particular novel. So I am definitely going to, listen to the recording for sure.
And
Okay.
I remember
I must tell
Runa's
you,
presentation
she
on
makes
Richard
excellent fish
Eaton.
curry.
Yeah. No, so I was the book, and I really feel sorry that I missed so much of it, but I'm going to listen to the recording and to catch up on what the book was about. I've just come in at the tail end, and I'm hearing the discussions, and they seem so interesting.
So, well, this was interesting. This is a book that very few of us have read completely. I think Sheena was the only, Paki, you've read it, right?
Yeah.
You have
We
read
did
it,
it in our
Shanti.
For our book club.
Sheena has read it, and I'm halfway through. That's how it is. So yes, intriguing book, interesting book. I shall definitely complete it for sure. Runa, thank you so much, because you've clearly shown us an area of literature that we were not very familiar with. That's always nice to feel that you've learned something new. And excellent PPT. So thank you everyone for being here. Come again for our next session. And newcomers, you will get the calendar. Okay, and you can have a look at it, and you will know what to expect.